The Black Matter is Life Poetry for Engagement and Overcoming, where we're exploring and discussing the rich tradition and innovation found in African American poetry. For many of you who are on here, you've been to two of our first two. And you know, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire promotes awareness and appreciation of African American history and life in order to build more inclusive communities today. Before we get started and going into our program, I wanted to have our office manager, Gina Broker, to explain a little bit about Zoom so she can do some of the technical housekeeping stuff. Gina?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Just have a couple of housekeeping notes. First, we ask that everyone should be muted at this point. We ask that you stay muted for the duration of the program until the end when we open the floor for discussion. Also, if you have any questions for either the moderators, the hosts, or our guest poet, please put it in the chat. If you have any problems with your Zoom, with any technical problems that you need to ask our IT team, please preface your question in the chat with the letters IT. That's what our IT team will be looking for. And now I am going to turn it back to Jerry Ann.
Thank you, Gina. So our poetry series, the first one was about signifying on the tradition of poetry. Our second one was on protest poetry. And the series, tonight's program is Love, Love, Love. The whole series came about in the wake of our nation's current unrest. And so we created this series to build bridges across the racial divide by introducing you, our audience, to the writings of a number of African-American poets whose work have shone a light on a rich cultural heritage. This program asks our audience to consider how African-American poetry provides tools for healing our nation's deep racial divides. Tonight's program is all about finding joy in simply staying alive in a world hostile to one existence. And for our program tonight, helping us with this discussion are two amazing facilitators. Dr. Dennis Britton, who's the Associate Professor of English at the University of New Hampshire, where he teaches courses on Shakespeare and medieval and Renaissance British literature. And joining him is Dr. Reginald Wilburn, who's an Associate Professor of English, specializing in African-American literature and culture, Milton, and the intertextuality studies at the University of New Hampshire. I won't keep us much longer because we want to get into these poems. The poems that we're looking at tonight are in the chat. Our featured poems are The Lover's Farewell, A Lovely Love, Resignation, and our guest poet tonight is Jericho Brown. So without much ado, I'll pass you over to our facilitators, Dennis and Reginald, Dr. Wilburn.
Thank you, Jerry Ann. Hey there, Dennis, how you be?
I'd be okay. How are you, Reggie? It's good to see you.
To be, not to be. That is the Hamlet question.
Yes, yes.
So why don't we get started with The Lover's Farewell by George Moses Horton. And I guess we'll give the people some of what they want. Maybe we could trade verses. Would you like to get us started?
I can do that. So The Lover's Farewell. And wilt thou, love, my soul display, and all my secret thoughts betray? I strove but could not hold thee fast. My heart flies off with thee at last.
The favorite daughter of the dawn, on love's mild breeze will soon be gone. I strove but could not cease to love, nor from my heart the weight remove.
And wilt thou, love, my soul beguile, and gull the favorite with a smile? Nay, soft affection answers nay, and beauty wings my heart away.
I steal on tiptoe from these bowers, all spangled with 1,000 flowers. I sigh, yet leave them all behind to gain the object of my mind.
And wilt thou, love, command my soul and waft me with a light control? Adieu to all the blooms of May. Farewell, I fly with love away.
I leave my parents here behind, and all my friends to love resigned. 'Tis grief to go, but death to stay. Farewell, I'm gone with love away.
All right. Well,
Mhm.
Dr. Wilburn, maybe you can help us with a little bit about who Horton was, right? He's not probably a poet that most are familiar with. So,
You're trying to put me on the spot.
well, I know you know a little something. We talked about it.
Well, actually, this poem comes from his 1829 collection of poems. Um, Horton is probably like the next major African American poet after Phyllis Wheatley. He was a slave in the early 19th century, ultimately was emancipated in the 1860s, actually right around the Civil War, the ending of the Civil War. He's from North Carolina. And interestingly, he was self-taught and made a lot of money because he lived, well, a lot of money, made some money because he lived sort of like 10 miles from UNC, Chapel Hill. And he was known for writing love poetry for the students there. And so when they didn't pay him with money, they paid him for his intellectual labor with collections of Shakespeare, Byron, Milton. So we definitely have some things to talk about there, and other English classical poets. And so I think that's a nice context to who he is. And I think, his verse tends to be rather free flowing, light, ease, and easy breezy. But I think as this poem, and as we probably will talk about, this poem sort of really puts love. It asks us to question love quite differently because it seems rather indeterminate from a 21st century mindset. So I don't know if that's enough context for you, but maybe we can dive in and talk about some of the figures and turns of thought and ideas that come out in the poem.
Yeah, sounds perfect. Perfect. Exactly what I needed. Thank you. Yeah, we were talking about this poem, we were struggling, right? On the one hand, the poem is, accessible, right? In our last conversation with Patricia Smith, right? As we were talking about Elizabeth Alexander's poem, right? We were saying, we talked about the ways in which that poem in a lot of ways was difficult, right? And trying to figure out even what the poem was about was a challenge. On this one hand, like, well, we know this is about love. It's a love poem, right? But then as you read it, you're like, what is love? What is what is he actually talking to? Is love a person or is love a concept? Became one of the questions that I was asking. And I think that question emerges at the very first stanza. And wilt thou love my soul display? Right. So, is he speaking to a particular person who is the object of love, who he's calling love, or is he speaking to this abstract concept, right, that we call love?
And then we see, a lot of the classical figures like the daughter of the dawn in the second stanza, right? And love's mild breeze. And here I'm sort of hearing even resonances of like Wheatley's, of imagination or on imagination, right? And sort of playing with the bowers, right? And the spangled with 1,000 flowers. And so, of course, that's my Milton coming on, right? The Paradise Lost. But this figure of Edenic bliss. And then, we get the blooms of May, and then farewell, I fly with love away. And we still don't know what this love is, who is the lover, that's the persona or speaker of the poem. And then we get this interesting last stanza, I leave my parents here behind, and all my friends to love resign. And I hadn't thought about this word sort of is a nice bridge to our Nikki Giovanni poem. But 'tis grief to go, but death to stay, farewell, I'm gone with love away. And, by the time you invoke family and friends, for me, it doesn't so much seem like a lovely love, a lovely romantic love, and I'm signifying yet again. But maybe this is love as the concept that you were talking about. And because I know that he's an enslaved poet, I'm wondering if this is just sort of a fugitive escape of the mind, right, and the intellectual artistry of poetry, much like Wheatley does throughout many of her poems. So that's sort of where my mind is when I'm thinking about this poem and trying to figure out who this lover is and what is the love in this poem.
Yeah. And I think that reference back to Wheatley's imagination, right? That's we talked about all the images of movement and flight and travel, right? And although and some, although bodily movement is restricted for enslaved peoples, right? Wheatley is saying, well, my mind is free, right? And I can travel wherever I want in my mind, right? And I think, there's a way in which love, on the one hand, is this thing that is, it's causing some anguish, right, for the poet, right? Wilt thou my soul betray, right? But on the other hand, but at the end, right, I'm going with it, right? And there's this movement away from the family, right? From home, right? Wherever that home might be, right? And as you said, if he's an enslaved person, right? Not that, all poetry is somehow, directly related to the author in a sort of autobiographical way, but it is really interesting to think about, like, what does it mean for an enslaved poet to be thinking about or be using this imagery of movement and flying away and leaving one's family behind, right? In the context of a love poem at that, right?
Yeah. It's sort of like a stealing away in the Negro spiritual sense of it, right? And so that there's this very interesting fugitive poetics that may be playing itself out here, knowing that he is the slave, right, in North Carolina. So it's definitely that you want to kind of shift on to Gwendolyn Brooks.
Let's look at Brooks. Let's look at Brooks then. Yeah. And I think so. You chose this poem, so I know we sort of chose poems and agreed on. But I know Reggie really liked this poem. So
yeah, well, this poem, and I found it. This poem, I was introduced to it like in 1997. I was an undergraduate at the University of the District of Columbia. I was in the Gateway course for the English course, and this poem, "A Lovely Love," was one of the assigned poems that we had to write on. And I mean, it's a sonnet, so it is a love poem. But what Brooks does with this English sonnet, this Shakespearean sonnet, it is not the sonnet that we teach in our 17th century or early modern courses, right? And as I've come to recognize and really love when Black poets take the sonnet tradition, I mean, even Jericho is sort of playing with that, and we can talk about that later in his sort of new variation on the sonnet form. But when we do that, right, or when Black poets take the sonnet form, they're infusing and injecting within it a new level of meaning, right? And what I love about it is it's an intertextual moment. It's an intertextual affair that is often political, right? And it has these resonances of the abundance that come, that we sort of get with Black culture. And so why I love this poem is because I wrestled with the meaning, right? And again, we talked about the word indeterminate, right? Love as indeterminate. And I remember as an undergrad, and even when I come back to this poem now, I sort of feel like I know what's going on and I understand it and I can put flesh on the bones of interpretation, but there's always some density and resistance, right? And the word choice, janitor javelin's epithet, right? And cheapening hyacinth darkness and let it be stairways in a splintery box. And, and then we move into the sort of messianic figures of the swaddling clothes and people are coming, they must not catch us here, definitionless in this strict atmosphere. And while I think I know what's going on, there's never full certitude. I tell my students, the more you give to a poem, the more it's going to give back to you. The more questions you ask, the more it's going to give and raise more questions. And so I like the indeterminacy of this poem, even as I find it sublime and beautiful. And this opening line, let it be alleys, let it be a hall, right, whose janitor javelin's epithet and thought to cheapen hyacinth darkness that we sought, and played we found rot make the petals fall. And knowing that, particularly like a lot of her kitchenette poems and her Street from Bronzeville poems are really sort of taking the South Side of Chicago and urban Chicago, the one-room tenements, right, where bathrooms are shared, right? You divide different apartments up into a kitchenette, and this is Black living, right, in the inner city and compressed and confined, living and stacked on top of one another. Very much like how I've been thinking about the recent elections, right? And, it struck me that many of our students may not understand how is it that Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Atlanta, right, Detroit, right? How can they come through in the way that they are? When you look at these states visually and you see how red they are, how can these small spots of blue, right, do so much for the vote, to rock the vote, right? And I think here's an example of that that's alluded to that, right? The sort of tenement living and living on top of one another with such density, and how Brooks compacts all of that, makes us feel all of that within this love that is not the free roaming love that perhaps we are taught to think about and envision in fairy tale lore.
I have a comment about that, but we have a request. Would you mind reading the poem for us?
Okay. Let it be alleys, let it be a hall whose janitor javelins epithet and thought to cheapen hyacinth darkness that we sought, and played we found rot make the petals fall. Let it be stairways and a splintery box where you have thrown me, scraped me with your kiss, have homed me, have released me after this, cavern kindness smiled away our shocks. That is the birthright of our lovely love in swaddling clothes, not like that other one, not lit by any fondling star above, not found by any wise men either. Run, people are coming. They must not catch us here. Definitionless in this strict atmosphere.
Thank you. I mean, I love what you had to say about the sort of compactness of it. And like you're in the, there's in the ways in which the poem itself might be enacting, right, the cramped living conditions, right, in the tenements, right, in urban inner cities, right, and the conditions which Black people find them living. Right. And I'm also, just thinking about the form too now, right? So, I mean, I often teach Shakespeare sonnets, right? And you mentioned this earlier. And for the folks who may not know exactly what a Shakespeare sonnet is, right? Shakespeare sonnets have a particular rhyme scheme. Like there's 3 quatrains or 3 lines of 4 that rhyme A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G, right? So Brooks is using this very traditional, compact, and it's really, the form itself is very stripped, right? If you sort of think about even the way in which it has to rhyme, and and what has to be sort of everything you want to contain, right? Just in that very limited number of lines, right? And it's like, and as you mentioned,
and iambic pentameter.
Right. On top of that, right? It's so strict. It's so confining on one hand as a form, right? And I think maybe that's maybe that's why the form was attracted to her, right? I'm not sure. On the one hand, it's also, images that we don't expect to see in love poetry. I mean, I loved you talking about the janitor's javelin. I'm like, someone in the comments, I was particularly struck by scraped with the kiss, right? Like this sorts of rot, right? Splintery boxes, that on the one hand, we sort of have these ideas of what love poetry should look like, right? And maybe we expect to see hyacinthines, right? Flowers, but we don't expect to see hyacinthine darkness, right?
But not next to the rot of garbage, right?
Right, yes, right. Not next to garbage. Yes. But how do you love in the ghetto?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. As I was, yeah.
No, go ahead.
I would call this a Sade sonnet, right? This is no ordinary love, right? And it's turning on the tradition of the sonnet. I mean, even we were talking about the iambic pentameter, where every line is supposed to have 10 syllables, and yet she's breaking them in certain lines. And what does that mean? And ultimately for me, the morality, right? The moral and ethics of who gets to love in a certain way. I think it's very easy. This kind of love that's happening cheaply up under a staircase, right? If we're gonna get funky with it, right? If we're gonna really read this closely, like this is not the love. This is a love that comes with moral judgment from the eyes of a certain reader. And so for me, who has the luxury to love Edenically, right? And how easy it could be to point our fingers at this kind of love within a system that makes it necessary and possible for folk to live so strictly, so compactly, right? How do you, I mean, and we know that the rents that were charged for those kitchenette apartments, right? That's highway robbery, right? And so all of the things that we associate with the ghetto or the inner city, right? How are the isms of life implicated in that? And if we can recognize that the isms of life are implicated in that, what business do we have judging Lillian or the persona of this poem, right? And I think that there's a larger critique and indictment to be made on those of us who are privileged to cast moral aspersions on folk for whom this is love.
Right. And lovely love at that, right? Lovely love, right? So the, you know, completely renaming, right? Renaming this type of love itself, right? It's not right in the ways we you just been describing. Maybe we should, I'm looking at the time, we should talk about Giovanni's Resignation.
Yeah, this is now in your halo.
Yeah, yes. So I just love Giovanni. I just, whenever I can get a chance to read her, I'm like, read her. And it's, the poem's a little on the long side, so I won't read the whole thing. I'll just read, I'll read the opening stanza and then just one stanza that I just feel like it needs to be heard.
Okay.
I love you because the earth turns round the sun, because the north wind blows north sometimes, because the Pope is Catholic and most rabbis Jewish, because the winters flow into springs and the air clears after a storm, because only my love for you, despite the charms of gravity, keeps me from falling off this earth into another dimension. I love you because it's the natural order of things. I'm gonna skip down to another poem I just love. I am helpless in my love for you. It makes me so happy to hear you call my name. I am amazed you can resist locking me in an echo chamber where your voice reverberates through the four walls, sending me into spasmodic ecstasy. I love you because it has been so good for so long that if I didn't love you, I'd have to be born again. And that's not a theological statement. I am pitiful in my love for you. I just love
this poem.
I love the, on the one hand, I love the title on the one hand. We did talk about this, right? The resignation, like what is a resignation? You know, we don't usually have good connotations with resignation, right? Either I'm sick of this job or I got to leave this job because I'm not fit for it. Here's my resignation,
yes,
right? Or it's like, I can't do any better, so I might as well, you know, resign to this, you know, to the situation I'm in, right? So, you know, to pair love and resignation already seems to be a strange pairing.
Yes.
Right. And yet the poem, you know, at the end of the poem, I love you, I love you, I love you. It's so emphatic.
Yes.
Right. And on the one hand, I think as you're reading the poem, you're like, well, you know, is this perfect love? Right. You know, it maybe not, but, you know, the speaker is committed to it. Absolutely, without a doubt. And, you know, if you have to ask the speaker why why the speaker loves, we get a long list of because, right? And then you can deconstruct, you can analyze the becauses, right? I love you because the earth turns round the sun. And you're like, okay.
That's natural.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. It just is, right? It's a fact of nature. You know, is it a real explanation? You know, it's not that I love you because, you know, I don't know, you paid my bills, or I don't know, or I loved you because, you know, you treat me kindly, or, you know, you look good, right? You know, it's an explanation, but it's also not an explanation, right? Anyways, I'll stop. What do you think?
I would argue it is. I would argue it is. The
Okay.
explanation is, it is what it is. It's like Stevie Wonder's ass, right? It is what it is because the sun does this. I love you. It's the natural order of things, just because.
Just because, right, right. Can no more be questioned than the gravity that keeps us on the planet, right? Yeah. even though the speaker does seem to be a little desperate at times, but that's okay, right? That's what it means to be in love, right? I mean, I think this, it's like, if you're really in love, right, you're going to be desperate a little bit.
Yeah, especially if you're having spasmodic ecstasy.
Well,
I'm here for all of that.
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. But yeah, I mean, I can't even talk about love poetry without saying love, right? But this long list, right? And at the end of the day, right, I think it's another sort of question, another way of sort of talking about the indeterminacy of love, right? Or at least the indeterminacy of the feeling, right? If you ask anybody to explain why they love another person, right? On the one hand, it's really hard to put into words, right? And and we just get these different images, right? You have to sort of get this long list of images coming from here and there, from these different spheres, these different walks, places, experiences. And maybe somehow when we put it all together, right, we get this explanation, right? Or we get this picture.
Yeah.
So
I think we should move on and
I think we should
introduce our fourth poem with our featured speaker.
Yes. So yes, it is at this point that we are excited to welcome our featured poet, Jericho Brown. Jericho Brown is author of The Tradition, a poetry collection published in 2019, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as he is a winner of the Whiting Award. His poems have been featured in numerous places, including the Bennington Review, BuzzFeed, Fence, Jubilant, The New Yorker, The New Republic Times, the Paris Review, and again, a whole lot of other places, as well as in several volumes of the best American poetry. Jericho Brown is also the director of creative writing and a professor of English at Emory University. And it is our absolute honor and privilege to introduce and talk about love poetry with Jericho Brown.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey.
How are you tonight?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing okay. Thank you. Doing well. Doing well.
I'm a little shiny because I'm well moisturized.
Nothing wrong with that. Well, it's cold up here, so you need to be well moisturized if you live in New Hampshire. So. All right. So you are one of our featured poets, and we read for tonight, Like Father, right? Thinking about the ways in which you yourself have written about love and love in different types of love from different types of perspectives. So I guess we would just like to hear, what you have to say about, love poetry, writing love poetry, anything we've been talking about so far with regard to the poems we've talked about.
Yeah, well, I do have a few things to say. One thing is, it's always so interesting to me to watch people talk about poetry and how much talking about poetry brings up popular song. And I think that happens all the more when you're talking about love poetry. So when Black people talk about poetry, or when Black people talk about Black poems in particular, it's almost as if that which is the lyric poem moves directly into, in our conversation, that which is the lyric song. And I love the fact, I mean, one of the things I love about being Black, and one of the things that I love about Black people, is how much music we still have in common. I still have fears. I love it so much that I have fears about it, because we actually have less music in common than we used to, right? I mean, there used to be a time that everybody Black, no matter what their age was, knew all the words to Love and Happiness. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And when I logged on, I was all excited. I was like, I don't know who I don't know who the DJ was, but it was like the Isley Brothers were playing. What I get. Which is a gift, and even in the chat, people were, as y'all would talk, people would say, oh, this reminds me of this song, or this reminds me of that song. And I got a little upset because one of you said something about I love you just because, and nobody mentioned Anita Baker. And I felt like that was a glaring.
How did he miss it, right?
I mean, you gotta catch these. So I'm interested in that, but I'm also in what that I think means for Black people and Black poets in particular, is that when we read and write poetry, we are bringing to that poetry, to the love poem, not just our history of love poems and not just our history of being in love. We are bringing all the music that we have in common. And I think that's exceptional and particular for us. That's not to say that we don't all know a song by, I don't know, Madonna, I guess, or somebody who's not Black. Do y'all understand what I mean? That is to say, though, that when we are talking about love, we are talking about how we have seen love and how we have been able to see love in our community, right? Which is particular. And that's part of why it is impossible to talk about what Gwendolyn Brooks is trying to get at when she's trying to get at Black love in spite of whatever the living situation may be. Now, also talking about the lyrics in contemporary music where that has happened as well. So that was one thing that I thought was really interesting. And the other thing is, I love Nikki Giovanni too. And I think she's been such a huge support for me personally as a poet. And obviously even before I knew her, she was one of my favorite people on the planet Earth. You know, when you're a kid and you're interested in things like writing, Nikki Giovanni is somebody who, it's almost as if God invented Nikki Giovanni for those of us who want to weigh in to this life, you know, and she's very much there for us. But all that said, I was just interested in the conversation, the just because conversation, right? That, and this is in my own poems, I think one of the things that I can't get over is how much love defies logic, which is why I can't stop writing about love. I can't stop writing about love because it makes no sense. And we know it makes no sense because you will live your whole life in Massachusetts and meet somebody who lives in California, and you will stop living in Massachusetts to suddenly live in California because of one person. I think that's crazy. Do you know what I mean? So when I'm writing my poems, I'm thinking about just how much love doesn't make any sense. How you love, I mean, I always think, you know, we love who we love because somehow they are ours. Obviously you don't love people. I mean, it would be nice if you could love people because of what they do, but obviously we don't, right? Because if that were the case, we would never love anybody because everybody keeps doing crazy, stupid stuff. Do y'all know what I'm saying? Like if we're supposed to be here loving people based on, oh, you did these 7 good things, but only those 2 bad things, then we would never love nobody because nobody has that time for that kind of math. Do you know what I mean? So I love, you know, the one way to think about this is, you know, we love our children because they're ours. You know, we love our parents because they're ours. That doesn't mean that they're always good at being parents. Do you follow what I'm saying? So I'm just sort of interested in how love defies all of the things that love defies. So I could say that. Does that help? Was that good?
Of course it does. How do you imagine your poem that we're reading for today fits into your thinking about love and African-American poetry, the Light Father?
That's a good question. Can I read it? Maybe I should read it.
Yes, please, please, please.
And I'll be able to remember it. This is a poem from my first book. And in all honesty, whenever I read from my first book, I'm always like, Lord, I hope I don't embarrass myself. Okay. Like Father. My father's embrace is tighter now that he knows he is not the only man in my life. He whispers, remember when, and I love you, as he holds my hand hungry for a discussion of Bible scriptures over breakfast. He pours cups of coffee I can't stop spilling. My father's embrace is firm and warm now that he knows. He begs forgiveness for anything he may have done to make me turn to abomination as he watches my eggs scrambled, soft. Yolk runs all over the plate. A rubber band binds the morning paper. My father's embrace tightens, grits stiffen. I hug back like a little boy gripping to prove his handshake. Daddy squeezes me close, but I cannot feel his heartbeat, and he cannot hear mine. There is too much flesh between us, two men in love. Um, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to talk about one's own poem, particularly if we just finished talking about Gwendolyn Brooks's. You know, I always feel like after you talk about Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, it's really probably time to shut up, but I do want y'all to deliver me my check. So,
so you got to say something.
I want you to have it.
So I will say, you know, obviously this is a love poem directed more about a father-son relationship than it is about any kind of a love relationship, any kind of a romantic or erotic love relationship. But the poem makes use of what the speaker knows about romantic and erotic love in order to create its metaphors, but also in order to create its conflict. So the trouble with the father and the son in this poem is clearly that the son is queer. And the father has somehow found out about it, right? And that becomes a certain kind of an impasse in their relationship. There's some religion in here, which is also, you know, the height of love, is that agape love. And so one of the questions I think this poem brings up is how to love and believe in a higher power at the same time, particularly if you're told, as is the case by many religions throughout the world, if you're told that you should not exist, your love should not exist. I mean, if your love exists, therefore you should not exist, right? So that's one of the things happening here. The other thing I think that the poem is trying to do, just reading it right now, is make use of that which is mundane, that which is domestic, that which we do not usually think of automatically as grand or grandiose, and lift those things. So we have the breakfast table, we have the eggs, we have these other things taking on larger proportions because they're happening in the midst of this conflict between the father and the son. And then this poem is definitely doing a thing that I think I'm always trying to do in my poems, and that is really figure out what masculinity is. When people say masculine, what, you know, many of my poems are probably interrogating the idea of masculinity, the idea of manhood, what that is, and what do we associate with that. Is it possible to have those things without also being an absolute horrible human being? And where does masculinity and manhood intersect with vulnerability and intimacy? Because, you know, our culture would have us believe that they don't. And if anybody's going to be able to show that they do, at this point, it's going to have to be the poets. We might have I think we used to have that from more of the singers, but we have, I think, very little of that from the singers in the same way that we used to have it. I mean, one, you know, at the advent of hip hop, the hip hop artists and the singers look different. Do y'all remember that? The hip hop artists wore what hip hop artists were wearing, and the singers wore suits.
Yeah.
Everybody is dressed the same, right? And in spite of the fact that the hip hop artists are now all literally just singers, we still, do y'all understand? Like Drake is just singing. I mean,
right.
Like since Nelly, like all the hip hop artists have just been belting ass singers, right? It's like if you listen to a Nelly song, it's like, bruh, like seriously, you know, but somehow or another that got called rap at that time, right? So we don't have those same kind of distinctions. And because we have this sort of outer packaging that we associate with a kind of invulnerability, then, you know, we have to listen a little more closely to these lyrics to see where people are maintaining a kind of vulnerability. So I think what the poets have is we have the opportunity to look many ways. I mean, already, I think I'm your third or the fourth poet in the series. And so just looking at me now, you see, we literally present ourselves in very many ways. And part of what I think the poets are doing, the Black poets today in particular, we want to be who we are individually in order to be able to participate in community in this way, or with one another. So the older I get, the better I am at being who I am, rather than trying to be somebody's idea of something. And the more I can be who I am, the more I can be comfortable with talking about stuff like what gets talked about in this poem. Does
Mm-hmm.
that, so I guess that's what this poem is about.
Yeah, it made sense to me. I mean, we had this poem, we both had very visceral reactions and responses to it when we were talking about it over the weekend. And, for me, the phrase that I kept thinking about was this queer theology, sort of taking E. Patrick Johnson's notion of queer as opposed to queer, to really look at the Black specificity of those intersections you were talking about, and thinking about the role of religion, this father whose attempt to love makes his son's being an abomination, right? And how do you come back from that? Like this reunion of sorts. How do you come back and love through the lens of religion? And I guess as I read the poem too, perhaps a potential for the father to be cognizant of the sins of the father, right? And how do you come back and love the son when you've done wrong, right? And where's the penance? Where's the penance for that? Where's the contrition for that? What does it look like? And then for the queer son, right? How do you set those weights aside and still love this man, right? So all of those were interesting. And then I just love the image of the stiff grits, right? Like anyone who knows anything about, anyone who loves grits, like that stiff grits don't work, right? Like if it ain't runny and loose.
Yeah, we
like,
talked about the stiff grits, like everybody.
It's like really, like, I mean, you don't even want to put stiff grits in your mouth, right? They're cold. They're too firm. They're too flabby. So I just really love that image myself.
Yeah, I'm also thinking just about how, this is not American culture. This is just culture. Maybe it's more society than it is culture, but we just center ourselves all the time. You know what I mean? And so men, particularly like cisgender straight men, I think have a lot of trouble encountering that which is queer, because then the ability to relate, they assume, will not be automatic. And that is so scary, particularly if you've put yourself at the center. So if you've put yourself at the center, it's sort of like, it's the same thing that happens when people walk up to me and ask me if I want to play basketball with them. It's like they've put themselves at the center. And so when they're approaching me, it's about their assumptions about me. And so then when I do something that subverts those assumptions, they are offended. And their offense isn't about me. It's about those assumptions. It's about, I need to be the most important person in the world, and everybody else needs to relate in the way that I expect them to relate. And that's a longer activist and political road to go down. But hopefully my poems help us take, half a step down it, right?
Yes. And you're well within that tradition, right? Then I think of the pick of the Black poet as as prophet, right? As seer, right? As really helping us. I think this is what the best poetry does, but the best African American poetry really does, or maybe not. I don't want to say best. That's putting a value judgment on it, but an ability to, in being yourself, right? An ability to see outside of our sort of normative lenses, right? And I think, particularly, I was really resonating what you were saying about masculinity. In particular, I think, in particular, there's particular issues around Black masculinity that you noted, right? And in the ways in which, if there was a place for sort of vulnerable Black masculinity, the hip hop, not that hip hop is everything in the culture, right? But in the ways in which, in at least, and we look at our music, in the dress, right? The sorts of distinctions are no longer there. I feel like I'm rambling. I want to talk about the title, but one of the things I was also interested in, I think, back to your point about, well, how do we learn what masculinity is and what it means to be a man, right? I think particularly the ways in which people center themselves. Reggie and I were talking about, is the title a simile, kind of like father, right? And to what extent, it's part of the problem, around masculinity, and all the narratives around Black masculinity and narratives around Black men and their fathers and the relationships there, is the expectation, right? Or that somehow fathers or sons are like their fathers, right? And to what extent, does having a queer son produce, maybe it raises the question of likeness, right?
It makes me wonder if I would have a boyfriend if my dad hadn't had so many girlfriends, right? Like maybe I could keep a man. If my daddy wasn't so good with the ladies, I might have been able to keep a man. Anyway.
It's a poem. It's a poem.
It's a poem. It's a poem, right?
It's a poem. Yeah, can I say this thing about prophecy? I know you sort of went away from that, but Baldwin talks about this a lot, about how Black people have knowledge of themselves as well as white counterparts or even other races in ways that other people don't, given they don't, white people don't have to know about themselves. And if you don't have to do something in this nation, you generally don't do it. And it's really interesting to be in this moment. And nobody, I just am bothered by the fact that nobody is going on TV to say, nobody who should is going on TV to say, all those Black people were right. Like there were Black people on television, on social media, on this couch, saying what the next 4 years were going to look like in 2015 and 16. You know what I mean? So it's so interesting.
I do.
And people were calling.
You've been saying it for decades and centuries.
Yeah, and it's really, and so I get right today, I'm like, and I really felt this way, during the insurrection and right after. I was like, why is my phone not ringing? Somebody ought to be apologizing to me. I remember making a bet with Paul Muldoon, who has not given me my money yet, when Trump was elected, the Irish poet, Paul Muldoon, who used to be the editor, the poetry editor at the New Yorker. He said, he won't be president for 2 months before they. And I said, Paul, do you want to put money on this? Because I really, I'm always interested. It's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to be in this moment where all these Black people were right, and still nobody's acting like we were, like this outrageous thing that happened, this outrageous thing that happens in, like, this is the kind of thing that literally happens in poems in my second book, and that I can say happens in the poems of other people's books.
Yeah, it's in the word.
2014 and 15 to now, right? These things are happening in our books before they happen, right? The reason why we are putting them in our books is because our love of this nation, which is always a crazy thing to have when you are Black. You are quite aware of the love of your nation when you're Black, because you know that it is absolutely silly to have.
Yes.
You know what your nation is going to do to you.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Imagine what it must be like to know that you can open your device and see somebody shot in the back in front of their children by police, and that is not a surprise. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's the nation I live in.
Yes, and I know it every day. I know it everywhere I go.
Do you understand what I mean? So that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in writing about. But and that's sort of the prophecy thing that I wanted to speak to that you brought up. The second thing you asked was about the title, and obviously I was going with Like Father, Like Son, which becomes really problematic when there's trouble, right? If nobody's talking, then nobody's talking. I actually never noticed this about this poem it's older, I never noticed that there's this trouble. And the reason the poem ends well, or I feel like I'm having this moment where I'm liking my poem, so y'all forgive me. I guess I'm not supposed to do that in public, but I think this is a lovely thing.
Help yourself.
There is too much flesh between us, two men in love. The fact that the impasse is there, and yet there is the declaration that we are in love anyway. We are who we are anyway, right? There's also the two men in love being the self in the poem and the other guy, right? You're my daddy, but you're not finna get between me and the other guy. Like, I either get both of y'all or I ain't gonna have nothing. Do you follow what I mean? Really? I mean, and that's about as queer as you can get. You know what I'm saying? Because I think I think what is not queer is the idea, and this is the trouble I have with the brothers in my chapter and why I think they don't like me. But one of the, they definitely don't like me. I don't just think it, but this might be the reason why they don't like me. That choosing is not queer.
It just is.
Yeah, like the idea that I can have my dad or I can have my man is not queer. What's queer is knowing I should have all of that.
Yes.
I want to make a world for myself where I get all of the stuff that I should have. That's queer. And that's not queer for queer people, y'all. That's queer.
Yes.
Make a decision that there are things that are just like, why can't I like live and breathe and be whole? You understand what I mean?
Right, yeah.
You make that decision, like when you make you're doing a queer thing when you think you want to have children and be a poet. Good luck. Make it work. That's love. Right. And if you don't, and when you are shutting off the love, I think, you're shutting off the love valve when you are out here trying to make decisions about these things. The decision is how to make them happen so that you can die knowing you did. For me, that's the decision. I'm talking too much. That's not about poetry.
No, but you preaching. If I had a Hammond B3, I'd be right behind you.
Oh, man. Jericho, we know that you have a couple of poems that you have agreed to read a couple of poems tonight. I know people in the chat have been asking for your inaugural poem, but if you read whatever you want to read.
Read the inaugural poem, and I'll read that other poem if we have time. I don't know what our time looks like, but I did give y'all another poem, but I'll read the inaugural poem and then we can see. This is a poem, for those of you who don't know, that came out yesterday that I wrote for the inauguration, which I wanted to do. Let's see. Inaugural. I should probably say, this poem is longer than what I'm usually the poet of a short lyric poem. And one of the things that I'm learning to do with the poem is to sort of stretch and having something like an inauguration gave me the opportunity to stretch to something longer. And the poem is obviously very new. So I'm just telling y'all that,
It's all good.
if you don't know what's going on, just come back to me later. Just go in and out. Inaugural. We were told that it is dangerous to touch, and yet we journeyed here, where what we believe meets what must be done. You want to see, in spite of my mask, my face. We imagine in time of disease, our grandmothers whole. We imagine an impossible America and call one another a fool for doing so. Grown up from the ground, thrown out of the sea, fallen from the sky. No matter how we've come a mighty long way. If I touch any of you, if I shake one hand, I am nearer another beginning. Can't you feel it? The trouble with me is I'm just like you. I don't want to be hopeful if it means I've got to be naive. I've been so low in my hunger, my hair's already been in the soup. And when I speak, it's just beneath my self-imposed halo. You'll forgive me if you can forgive yourself. I forgive you as you build a museum of weapons we soon visit just to see what we once were. I forgive us our debts. We were told to wake up grateful, so we try to fall asleep that way. Where then shall we put our pains when we want rest? I don't carry a knife, but I understand the desperation of those who do, which is why I am recounting the facts as calmly as I can. The year is new, and we mean to use our imaginations. One of us wants to raise George Stinney from the dead. One of us wants a small vial of the sweat left on Sylvia Rivera's headband. Some want to be the music made magical by Bill Withers's stutter. Others come with maps and magnifying glasses and graphite pencils to find locations beside the mind where we are not patrolled or surveilled or corralled or chained. I myself have come to reclaim the teeth in George Washington's mouth and plant them in the backyards of big houses that are not in my name. My cousins want to share a single bale of the cotton our mothers picked as children. I would love to live in a country that lets me grow old. I long for that. We are otherwise easily satisfied. Where do we get tangerines for cheap? Can we make it there on the metro? How hot is the fire fairy blister of chocolate chipotle sauce? And will you judge me if I taste it? But now we've put our hunger down for the time it takes to come and reconcile ourselves to the land because it is holy, to the water because it swallowed our ancestors, to the air because we are dumb enough to decide on something as difficult as love. If no one's punishment leads to my salvation, then accountability is what waits. It moves citizens, men's, nations. That's for us to prove. That's the deed to witness. That's the single item on the agenda read in braille or by eye, ink drying like blood spilled this American hour of our lives. So there's that poem. Thank you, y'all are clapping. Thank you, sweet. Reginald, you're so
funny. There's so many lines in that, oh my gosh, that I would just love to just.
Yeah, that was really like my first time ever reading it aloud to an audience. So I'm sorry, it wasn't my best reading.
Wow.
We're thankful. Wow. We're thankful for it. We're thankful for it.
Yeah, we feel honored. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I love the middle passage allusion, right? The swallowing our ancestors, the water because it swallowed our ancestors. But what I found myself really poring over was this accountability. To the air because we are dumb enough to decide on something as difficult as love. And there's the rub, right? There's that rub. We've been talking about love all night. Being dumb enough to decide on something as difficult as love when we know this nation doesn't love us back, or I would say love us black. And yet we continue, right? And so if no one's punishment leads to my salvation, then accountability is what waits. That accountability, it moves citizens and it mends nations, and that's for us to prove. And I think, thinking about this inaugural moment, what I've been calling this new Genesis, right? The deliverance is in the accountability, right? Facing and embracing the accountability. And then for us to witness, right? That's the deed to witness. When we see that, then we're living up to what was on paper, right? What the framers of our founding documents put on paper. And that the single item on the agenda read in braille or by eye, so all of us are gonna read it. Ink drying like blood spilled this American hour of our lives. I just love that last line. And I would love just a few more hours to just pour over each word. I could see me taking this into the classroom and wrecking the nation. But I think it's
yes.
So do you think we should maybe, I don't know, Jen, if you want to say something, but I know people are ready to.
Yeah, I know. I'm looking at the chat, and I think we probably should engage with our participants now. And Jerry Ann, did you have a word for us, or should we?
Or Courtney?
Oh, I would just pass it over. We do have a moderator for the Q&A. So I'm going to pass it over to Courtney Marshall, who is a teacher at Phillips Exeter. She teaches English at Phillips Exeter Academy and teaches Black feminist exercise classes on the title Jump at the Sun Fitness. So Courtney, if you can facilitate some questions and have the folks put, if you can put your questions in the chat, she will help us get through this as much as we can.
Yes, child, y'all put me on spotlight. I didn't know. Oh, hi everybody. So I'll be here going through the chat and just posing questions and things to the panelists. So one of the this is a comment that was raised, and it says that it's so interesting that each of the poets insert biblical and or theological references and negate them, but in a positive way that expands the poems without. Um, so I wonder if somebody, y'all nodded. I want to talk about biblical or theological references.
I just think it's always of use to reach out beyond oneself. And part of what we do when we make use of theological or biblical references or any myth is sort of we make an assumption about a kind of knowledge that anyone might have, right? A framework or an archetype or a set of mythologies that anyone might have. And when you do that, you create a world for the reader where they feel much more that they have access to you. So yes, you can do that with that which is biblical, obviously, even in a country where there are so many, people of so many religions. Because of what our country is, you can make use of biblical references and people will kind of have an idea what you're talking about. And you can do that with Greek myth. There's a way, it used to be, maybe it's less so, but there is a way that if I say Persephone or if I say Zeus, people have an idea who I'm talking about, thanks to the CW. So at least, right? So that is the kind of thing that I think biblical references allow for. For me, and they do that for me, but they also, I grew up with this stuff in a real way. I didn't grow up with it in, I'm a believer is the best way for me to say that. And as a believer, as a poet, I have to be in a position where I'm talking, a poem is a conversation with my higher self. A poem is a way Jericho gets to relate to the better Jericho, and poetry is quite obviously prayer. And because of that, I can use those things because that's really where I am. That's what I'm getting at and trying to get to and trying to better understand while I'm writing my poem.
And see, I also think that there's when I teach the poetry in our tradition, it's important to me for our students to understand that this is also a record of like an intellectual database, right? There's as you were talking about, there's a sense in which you can make certain references and they will be known, right? But what I love about Black engagement with Christianity is, right, it's not the religion that was given to us, right? And so there's a dissonance, there's a break, there's a rupture between this Christian religion that was given and then what we've done with it. And then, of course, what any individual writer does with that, right, becomes even an elaboration upon that database. And then I would also say it's no different than what Milton does. A lot of what we think is biblical about the Adam and Eve story, it really it's because Milton poeticized it and took some liberties with it, right? And so when we look at this English tradition, right, that's what white poets have been doing all along with these Christian resonances and images and the Greek myths and the classical tradition. So I think I really see it as like an intellectual database that's making a different type of argument as well, that's specific to any given writer.
It's also particularly interesting when you think about somebody like Phyllis Wheatley and you're faced with the fact that she's making use of so many biblical and religious allusions and completely subverting them, turning them inside out. She's like, why am I a slave if we all go into heaven to have a party?
Right.
And then in the context, she has that poem, like if you're reading a Phyllis Wheatley, like Selected or something, you get to that poem. I'm sorry, I don't know Wheatley well enough to name these poems. Y'all should have Honorée Fanna Jeffers come here and she'll tell you these exactly. But I remember, I'm reading Phyllis Wheatley and she has this poem where she has this, it makes me want to cry just thinking about it. She has this poem where she remembers her mother waking up in the morning and facing the east.
That's the hymn. I think that's one of the hymns. It's either it's the hymn of the evening or hymn of the morning, or one of those two, I think.
very aware that in that moment she's telling us her mother was Muslim.
Mhm.
You know, like those are the kinds of things that are
Mhm.
particularly
Mhm.
interesting to me if you really get into looking at the history of Black poetry and how it has arrived in this moment. But there are other questions.
Yes, I want to put a few together because I think it goes back to what you all were saying about the love poetry. Also will get us thinking about inaugural. So a comment that someone wrote is that inaugural is great. I love the consideration whether it's naive to be hopeful. And so I was wondering if we could maybe get you all to talk about the role of naivete and hopefulness, and maybe thinking about that in terms of romantic love, but also the new relationship, and it's going to be so great, thinking, but also linking that to love of country, right? Kind of this new moment, like kind of we're in this moment, we feel like we're in a new relationship with someone. So it seems like that's a way to kind of tie some of the poems together.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, and is that sometimes love poetry is not always about love, right? And I think, I know, Jericho, you were referring to this earlier, or we were talking about the ways in which love doesn't make any sense, right? And that might be one reason why poets keep returning to it, but it's also that sort of nonsensical nature, right? That we keep, even though, it didn't work out last time, or the time before that, but maybe this next time, but maybe this is the one, right? Like there's a way in which, right, that experience of love, right, can be a useful way of talking. Maybe that is the useful way of talking about our relationship to America, right? But maybe that's naive, right? I don't know. But I think there is, that tension between hopefulness and naivete, right? Because, on the one hand, is it possible to have hope without being naive? Maybe that's the question.
See, but then I wonder, without that hope, however naive it may be, what is left? Fatalism?
But that's the question. I don't know, right?
Black pessimism.
Yes.
Afro-pessimism.
Afro-pessimism? Yeah.
Afro-pessimism. Can I just say that I know that it's not, particularly for Black people, particularly for like smart Black people, it's really not, I think naivete is really what is being held in the balance in this moment. There's a huge attack, and maybe a very necessary, over the last 4 years, there's been a big attack on the fact of naivete. And there used to be a way that people looked at naivete as if it was cute, right? As if it was a mark of innocence. And I think that's fleeting. I think that's going away. And that's probably a good thing. I will add to that though, better is always better. And I particularly, and one way you know that better is better is if you're in a lot of pain, if you're in pain in your body, and that pain is eased in a little bit, that's better. Nobody who is in a lot of pain is like, that didn't help much, so just put it back the way it was. What? Nobody's doing that. Do you understand what I mean? Yeah. So, I'll say this and y'all can just be mad at me about it. What we have experienced over the last 4 years, mounting up to a couple Wednesdays ago, that much of that, I hope that people are really thinking about this in this way. A lot, like seeing children torn from their parents at the border, from the way Muslims were treated at the beginning of that administration, all the way up to that insurrection. These are things that would not have happened with any other president.
Yes. Especially the preceding one.
Yeah, like Mitt Romney could have been president and that wouldn't have happened. Do y'all understand what I mean? So I get what I get frustrated with in all of this, I understand that America is gonna America. Like I understand whiteness is gonna whiteness. Like I get that, I'm not a crazy person. But I also understand that I'm not a slave. You know, and this idea that there is no better, or that everybody is the same, that just stresses me out. Like this idea, oh, they all the same. Joe Biden just like Donald Trump. Like what? Joe Biden is Joe Biden. I'm sorry. This is how you know these people are crazy, by the way. These people are going to prison behind Joe Biden. Like you really want to risk it all on Joe Biden? Not AOC, not Bernie Sanders, not nobody who ain't crazy that people might have a reason to call crazy. Y'all understand what I'm saying?
Right.
Joe Biden is what you scared of? Across the aisle, Joe? You know what I mean? So that lets us know that we've got more than just divisiveness going on. We've got straight up fault in the earth. We got schism. Do y'all know what I'm saying? But the other thing that lets me know is when people are stupid, because that's just dumb. Like, I'm sorry, but Joe Biden and Donald Trump, no matter how capitalist their intentions might be, they are not the same. And I do not have to, if Joe Biden is president, I don't have the same things to cry about. Like, if there's a long list of things we got to cry about that we're going to stay up late about, why make that list longer? No. Like ameliorate my stress. Yeah. I'm all about amelioration. People think amelioration is a bad thing.
Right.
Ameliorate me all the way down. Baby and amelioration. You know what I'm saying?
Word of the night.
I understand that Trayvon Martin, that Tamir Rice, I think even, I might be mixing my years up. These people were murdered while Barack Obama was president. I'm not crazy. I'm not stupid. But I'm also, if you're gonna add, I am interested. I am interested in amelioration. I'll just stop it there.
Okay.
Everybody, that's the word of the night.
Yeah.
Amelioration.
Word score.
Were you gonna say something, Reggie?
No, I was just gonna ask if you had more questions.
Oh, there's a few. I'll try to again switch them together. So someone asked, what advice do you have to white poets trying to write about race? Someone else asked, do you have advice for young poets? So now this is kind of I'm not a poet, they're not talking to me. How do you use humor in your poems? And then there's also a question to bring us back to the title. Is Black love a daring concept? So there's a few questions about, being a good poet, and then is Black love a daring concept?
Okay, so these first two questions, I think I have the same answer. One is, I think it's a good idea if you want to be a poet that you read. And if you don't like reading poems, maybe you don't really want to be a poet. You have to imagine the way to think about your relationship to reading is to think about people who do not think about poets, because if you do, you're going to be stressed out. Think about the people you love in other areas and how they are good at what they do. Think about Serena Williams, think about LeBron James, think about Beyonce. That helps a lot. It's better to think about people who are not poets. So think about what Beyonce's life must be like when she is not on stage. Think about how much music Beyonce must have listened to in a day. Sunday, Saturday, any day. Think about the eyes with which LeBron James watches a basketball game. Not the eyes with which you watch a basketball game. What does LeBron James see when he's watching a basketball game? Also, what is LeBron James? What is Serena Williams' relationship to rehearsal, to practice? Who does she admire? Serena Williams, who does she admire? Who does she admire that does what she does? And if you could think about that, think about Barack Obama and the Constitution. He could probably recite that thing to you. You follow what I'm saying? It's a constitutional lawyer. who was president of the United States. You follow what I mean? So your relationship, if you want to be a poet, your relationship to poetry has to be that relationship that anybody has to the thing that they love most, that they have committed their lives to, right? And if you can't make that commitment, maybe you need to find that thing for you.
Yes.
So that's one thing. And you know, how do you do that? One way you do that is discipline. One day you do that is scheduling. We are able to be there for anybody. You know, if we got to pick up our kids at 2, we generally get there at 2:10, because you know they start charging you late fees at 2:15. Do you know what I'm saying? If you're supposed to be in class at 3, you usually logging on by 3:07. Do you understand what I mean? Like we are, but if we have to be there, we generally are where we're supposed to be. We can make a doctor's appointment, we can make a dentist appointment, but then when it's time to write your poems, you don't have time? What's wrong with you? You think something is right with everybody in the world who sent you a drive me crazy ass email, and you are going to be there for them because they sent you an email? You're gonna show up to a meeting because somebody did that to you? But you're not gonna, what's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with you. And you have to begin to live like it and treat yourself like it. If you can say you're going to be somewhere at 2 o'clock, decide that you're gonna be somewhere for yourself at 1 o'clock. Put your phone away, decide, you can decide now, every day, 12:30 to 1, no phone, no computer, me, a pen and some paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm gonna fail. The other thing is to commit yourself to failing. Treat what you're doing like play. There's a difference between trying to make a jump shot in a game and just doing it in your front yard by yourself. Mm-hmm. Practice, play. If you're playing, then when you mess up, you don't feel shame about it. You follow what I'm saying? Like, so you enjoy failure, enjoy getting it wrong. You keep enjoying getting it wrong, you will eventually get it right. And I think writing about any subject is the same way, particularly if it's a subject that you have never written about. Try to see how that has been done. And then the last thing I will say is just tell the truth. You know, a lot of, if it's natural for you to have a thing come up in a poem, let that thing come up. Mm-hmm. Part of what happens, this question about people who are not Black or not of color writing about race, can I say this about that? I think part of what happens there and why some of those poems end up failing is that people sit down to write a poem about race as opposed to sitting down to write. When I sit down, I don't try to write a poem about race. And I've been Black my whole life. That happens because I live, I pay attention, I look around, I talk to myself, I talk to my savior. Do you know what I'm saying? So when I sit down to write, my mom comes up. A little piece of trivia I know about Diana Ross and the Supremes comes up. Mm-hmm. Something about race comes up. Mm-hmm. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you're aware and you're in tune and you allow what falls down into the poem to fall down into the poem, then that what you really care about will come down. You don't want to write about something just because the time is telling you to write about it. Because that might not be what you are really concerned about. The question, I'm all for poets, no matter what their race is, writing about race, go for it. But the real question is, can you just live right about race? Like do you have to write about it? Like you are welcome to write about it, go for it. But actually, how are you treating people?
Can you live the life you write about in your song?
Yeah, come on, Clark sister.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So for me, make the ambitions big. Always make the ambitions big and make the ambitions about how it happens rather than the subject, right? When poets are writing, poets are thinking about things like, and everybody who's good at what they do thinks this way, but this is how it turns out to be in poetry. When poets are writing, and this is why poets get together and talk and don't nobody know what they're talking about when they get together. Poets are thinking, can I use an abstraction? is it possible for me to end a poem in a concrete? Is it possible for me to make a list in the middle of a poem? Is it possible for me to turn this poem from the first person to the second person all of a sudden in the middle of nowhere? That's the kind of stuff I'm thinking about. The stuff that happens in my poems, that's sort of second nature. What I'm thinking about is, how do I deliver that stuff? That's what makes me a poet. That's what makes me a professional. That's what makes me a practitioner at what I'm doing. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So yeah, that's what I think about that.
And then I would take up that other.
What'd you say? I'm sorry.
I would take up that other question. I think all love is risk.
Yeah, exactly.
All love is risk. It's to launch into the unknown, and we dare to hope that this is the one that we're gonna get it right.
Yeah. I don't know. I hear these things, but I've never been in love with or dated even anybody who isn't Black. So I don't know about Black love as particular in that way. I mean, I imagine it must be, but I don't know that.
And, and if I could, I wanted to get back, you alluded to this before, Jericho, but I think about this obsession with writing about love, and so many different themes known to poets. But it's almost like the corollary for me is, it's like the bowl of fruit in art, right? It's the quest to try and pin down meaning. It's a study. Right? Those things that we haven't mastered and conquered as in knowing, maybe that's what drives us back to work on, to do another variation on that theme. And maybe each new experience is like, doggone it, I thought I knew love, but I don't know it. I have to go back to the drawing board, right? And how many bowls of fruit, how many flowers have we looked at and seen in museums? I think they're intense character studies, right? And we're trying to pin down meaning for something that seems to get away from us, that's so indeterminate.
I think you're right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I cannot believe it's already 6:25. I'm not done with this conversation.
It's only 6:25 Eastern Standard Time.
only 6:25. Can we all just, I don't know, however you want to give Jericho his props. I just want to say thank you so much. This conversation has just been uplifting, stimulating, life-giving, all that stuff and more. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I don't know if you have words for Jericho, Reggie.
Oh, man, you the real deal. I'm just thankful. I'm just thankful for you this evening. I really enjoyed discussing and engaging with you, and yeah, you're great. And I can't wait. Look, by the next time you see me, I'll know half of your canon by heart. How about that?
Good luck with that. I want to hear every one of them too. Because I'll put you to the quiz.
Yeah, right. Uh-oh. There's gonna be a test, right?
Jericho, I hope
my Children's Day performance.
Jericho, I hope you'll stay on. There's another part of our program where we've asked our community members to write a response poem to one of the selected poems. And as our tradition has been, we have a little after party just ask questions. So I hope, if you don't mind, staying on for a little bit.
Okay, I'll stay on for a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So for our community poem, it is written by Roy Goodman and from Nashua, the Unitarian Universalist Church, and he'll read that shortly. Is Ray, can we highlight Roy Goodman? Hey, Roy. Gina, can you put his poem up? It's all yours, Roy. Roy, you have to unmute yourself.
All right, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, we will try this again. Why Resignation? Thoughts on Nikki Giovanni's poem. I wonder why she calls it resignation. Resignation suggests defeat, giving up, giving in. She gives in to nothing. She accepts it, inhales it, welcomes it, love that is, boldly, emphatically, joyously, easily, with eyes wide open, naturally, because it is the natural order of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roy. And am I supposed to do this? Dennis, are you going to do this part? Unmute. Unmute.
Thank you. By now you think I know how to do this. I cannot believe this is our last evening for this season, right? This last session of the Black Matter is Life. And Jericho Brown has closed us out with a bang, leaving us wanting more. And I just wanted to give a shout out, just say thank you to my colleague, my homeboy, my bruh, Dr. Welgener Rilburn. It's been a pleasure to have these conversations with you, and and I'll see you tomorrow probably, but anyways. But thank you, Reggie. I've really enjoyed.
This has been great. This has been great.
Great, excellent. We have to thank our sponsors. We could not have done or brought these programs to you without the help of our volunteers, our sponsors, and our partners. So we'd like to thank our sponsors, Bangor Savings Bank, Throwback Brewery, Tito's Homemade Vodka, Women of the Sea. And we'd also like to thank our partners, Black Lives Matter Nashua, especially Jaden Smith, the Youth Outreach Coordinator. As well, we'd like to thank the Keene, Nashua, Rye Public Libraries, and especially Carol Eman of Outreach and the Outreach and Marketing Librarian. Gina Boker, who's been behind the scenes, thank you so much. She's our office manager. We also like to thank Terry Robinson, Dan Comley, Suzanne Paquin, Mimi White, and Kirsten Barton. I'm always just amazed by just our amazing staff and all the work they do to bring these programs to us in little old New Hampshire. And most of all, we have to thank Jerry Ann Vogus for the vision and for the inspiration and for all the hard work she has done to bring us together. So thank you so much, Jerry Ann. Final words.
Thank you. So I thank everybody for being here. Go to our website for our next programs. Our Tea Talk starts February 7th through March 14th. Go on our website and see them. And I'm going to put Reggie on the spot to close this part of our program out. And I hope, Reggie, you'll say yes to closing us out with your beautiful voice in our Black tradition.
I'm gonna get you for this.
We were talking about poetry and song earlier, so
Yeah, they go together. How can we end this without a song?
Okay, I'm gonna give you just a little something that is unrehearsed. So please forgive. Can it be that it was all so simple then? Or has time rewritten every line? And if we had the chance to do it all again, tell me, would we? Could we? Oh, memories may be beautiful and yet What's too painful to remember? We simply choose to forget. So let the laughter we will remember whenever we remember the way we were. Remember the way we were. Okay, so give me a little extra check on that, Jerianne.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wilburn. And thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to bringing this program to you back again in the fall of 2021. Thank you.